Hey there, fellow knowledge seekers. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to click that notification bell so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Today, we're strapping on our scuba gear and plunging headfirst into the world of international law, specifically the International Court of Justice. Whether you're a UPSC aspirant prepping for the GS2 paper, a student brushing up on global affairs, or just someone who loves learning about how the world works, this one's for you.
You know, it's fascinating how this court, the ICJ, can make decisions that impact entire nations and shape the very fabric of international relations.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The ICJ sometimes gets called the World Court, but most people probably couldn't tell you what they actually do. Where do we even begin with something as complex as the International Court of Justice?
Well, like with most things, I think it helps to understand the history. The ICJ didn't just appear out of thin air. Its roots can be traced back to much earlier efforts at international arbitration.
You mean like trying to settle disputes without resorting to wars and all that?
Exactly. For instance, think about the Jay Treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain back in 1794. It was all about settling lingering issues from the American Revolutionary War. Debts, property rights, even those British forts that were still on American soil.
So they basically sat down and hashed it out instead of, launching another war. That's pretty forward-thinking for the 1700s.
It really was, and what's important is that it showed that international disputes could be resolved peacefully through negotiation and a neutral third party. That idea gained even more traction with cases like the Alabama Claims Arbitration in 1872, again between the U.S. and the U.K.
Hold on, remind me about the Alabama claims. What was that all about?
This one involved damages caused to American ships by Confederate warships built in Britain. During the American Civil War, it was a landmark case because it further reinforced the idea of international arbitration as a way to settle disputes even when the stakes were high.
So these early cases were like the building blocks for the ICJ.
Precisely. But it took some major global events to really push the idea of a permanent international court with real authority.
Let me guess, World War I and World War II.
You got it. After two devastating world wars, the international community was desperate for a way to prevent future conflicts. So as the United Nations was being formed in the aftermath of World War II, the idea of a strong international court to uphold peace and justice was front and center. And for those of you studying for the UPSC, this is where the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, officially enters the scene in 1946.
And it's still based in The Hague, Netherlands, right?
Yeah.
It's not kind of interesting. It's the only major UN body not located in New York City.
That's right. It's housed in the iconic Peace Palace, which kind of adds to its mystique, don't you think?
I guess even international judges need a bit of peace and quiet, away from all the diplomatic hustle and bustle.
Exactly. But more importantly, being situated in The Hague emphasizes the ICJ's independence as the judicial arm of the UN. It's not just another committee. It's a court meant to stand apart.
Okay, so we've got this impressive court set up in a beautiful building, but who actually gets to be a judge there? I imagine the qualifications are pretty intense.
Oh, absolutely. To be an ICJ judge, you have to be a recognized expert in international law. Think of it as the legal equivalent of winning an Olympic gold medal. But beyond just being a brilliant lawyer, you also need to be known for your high moral character and integrity.
Makes sense. You're dealing with disputes between entire nations, so you want the best of the best, right?
Exactly. You need people who are respected worldwide for their legal expertise and their ability to weigh complex issues fairly. And to ensure a global perspective, the 15 judges on the ICJ are elected from different regions of the world. This ensures a variety of viewpoints are represented.
So you have judges from all over the world coming together to interpret and apply international law. That's fascinating. But what exactly do they do? I mean, what kind of cases does the ICJ actually hear?
The ICJ actually has two main functions. First, it settles legal disputes between countries, kind of like the ultimate referee when two nations disagree on something related to international law.
Okay, so it's like the Supreme Court, but for the entire world.
That's a good way to think about it. The second function of the ICJ is to provide advisory opinions to UN bodies and specialized agencies on legal questions. So sometimes it acts like a legal advisor for the UN itself.
So sometimes it's settling arguments between countries, and sometimes it's giving legal advice to the UN? That's a pretty big responsibility.
It is. And here's the kicker. The court's judgments are final. There's no appeal process. That means those decisions carry a lot of weight on the international stage.
Wow, no pressure there. So I'm guessing the ICJ has dealt with some pretty impactful cases over the years, right? Ones that have actually shaped the course of international relations.
Absolutely. There are quite a few. But a particularly compelling example is the case of Kulbhushan Jadhav, an Indian national accused of espionage in Pakistan. This one really highlights the ICJ's ability to intervene in sensitive diplomatic situations.
Okay, this is ringing a bell. Remind me what happened in that case.
Well, India accused Pakistan of violating the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, basically by denying Jadhav access to Indian consular officials after his arrest. Things escalated quickly, and Pakistan ended up sentencing Jadhav to death.
Wow, talk about high stakes. So where does the ICJ come into all of this?
India took the case to the ICJ, arguing that Pakistan had violated Jadhav's rights under international law and seeking to halt his execution. The fact that the ICJ was willing to step into such a tense situation, involving two nuclear-armed countries no less, really demonstrates the court's potential influence.
It's like the ICJ becomes this last resort when diplomatic efforts have failed.
Exactly. And the Jadhav case had ripple effects beyond the immediate dispute. It sparked international debates about due process consular rights and the treatment of individuals accused of crimes in foreign countries. For anyone studying international relations or even just following current events, this case is a must-read.
It really shows you how these legal battles can sometimes play out on a global stage, with huge implications. And speaking of India's presence on the world stage, there was another recent development at the ICJ that caught my attention.
You're referring to the re-election of an Indian judge to the court. This was a significant victory for India diplomatically.
What made this election so noteworthy? Was it just about having an Indian judge on the court?
It was more than that. This election pitted a permanent member of the UN Security Council, the UK, against a non-permanent member, India. The fact that India secured the position is seen as a testament to its growing influence within the international legal system.
It's like a sign that India is becoming a major player in shaping international law. And you mentioned earlier that the ICJ doesn't just settle disputes between countries. It also provides advisory opinions. Can you give us an example of how that works in practice?
Certainly. The ICJ's advisory opinion on the decolonization of Mauritius and the disputed Chagos Archipelago is a great illustration of this function.
Okay, I have to admit I'm a little fuzzy on the details of that one. What's the story with Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago?
It's a complex situation rooted in colonialism. The Chagos Archipelago, which includes the strategically important Diego Garcia Island, was separated from Mauritius by the UK back in the 1960s.
And Diego Garcia is where that major U.S. military base is located, right?
You are correct. The UK leased Diego Garcia to the US, adding another layer of complexity to the issue. But Mauritius has always maintained that the separation of the Chagos Archipelago was unlawful and that it should be returned.
So how did this end up in front of the ICJ?
The UN General Assembly asked the ICJ for an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of the UK's continued administration of the Chagos Archipelago. Essentially, they wanted the court to weigh in on whether what the UK had done was legal under international law.
And what did the ICJ decide?
The court's opinion was that the UK's decolonization process was incomplete and that it needed to hand over the Chagos Archipelago to Mauritius to rectify the situation.
That's a pretty big deal. Did the UK just hand over the islands after that?
Well, it's not always that simple. The advisory opinion wasn't legally binding in the same way that a judgment in a dispute between two countries would be. But it put significant pressure on the UK to comply with international law and to re-examine its colonial legacy.
So the ICJ's advisory opinions can still have real-world consequences, even if they aren't technically enforceable.
Precisely. They carry a lot of moral and political weight and can influence how states behave, even in situations where they might prefer to ignore the court's opinion.
This has been really eye-opening. I'm starting to see how the ICJ, even with its limitations, can be a powerful force in shaping international relations. But let's be realistic here. There have to be some downsides, right? I mean, no system is perfect.
You are absolutely right. Despite its stature and importance, the ICJ faces a number of challenges that can limit its effectiveness.
Okay, let's dive into those limitations. What are some of the hurdles the ICJ has to deal with?
One of the most significant limitations, and one that's often debated, is the issue of jurisdiction. Specifically, the ICJ lacks what's called compulsory jurisdiction.
Okay, break that down for me. What does compulsory jurisdiction mean, and why is it such a big deal?
In simple terms, it means that countries have to agree or consent to be bound by the court's rulings. Unlike in domestic courts, where individuals are generally subject to the court's authority, states have more sovereignty on the international stage.
So a country can basically say, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want to play by your rules. All right, knowledge enthusiasts, we're back for the final leg of our journey into the fascinating world of the International Court of Justice.
It's been quite a swim. through the depths of international law.
It really has.
Yeah.
And I feel like we've uncovered some real gems along the way. Before we surface, though, let's take a moment to recap some of those key insights. What really stood out to you during our conversation?
For me, it was really driving home the point that the ICJ, while part of the UN system, is a unique entity with its own distinct role and responsibilities. It's not just another committee, it's the World Court, tasked with upholding international law and resolving disputes between sovereign nations.
That's a great point. And we talked about how the judges who sit on the ICJ are truly the cream of the crop. When it comes to legal expertise and moral standing, it made me realize that these individuals are more than just lawyers. They're diplomats, they're negotiators. They're kind of like the guardians of international peace in a way.
That's a really insightful observation. They have to navigate incredibly complex legal and political issues, often in situations where the stakes are incredibly high.
And we can't forget about those fascinating cases we explored. The Kulbushan Jadhav case was a powerful example of how the ICJ can step in when diplomatic channels break down and protect the rights of individuals even when powerful states are involved. It's a reminder that international law isn't just about abstract principles. It has real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And the advisory opinion on the decolonization of Mauritius and the Chagos Archipelago showcased the ICJ's role in shaping the global conversation around historical injustices and the rights of colonized peoples. It's a reminder that international law can be a tool for addressing past wrongs and promoting a more just and equitable world order.
But of course, we also have to acknowledge those limitations we discussed, the lack of compulsory jurisdiction and the potential influence of the Security Council's permanent members are realities that can't be ignored.
True, these limitations highlight the fact that the ICJ operates within a complex and sometimes messy international system. Power politics and national interests will always play a role.
But even with these constraints, the ICJ remains a vital institution, don't you think? It's a beacon of hope for a world where disputes are settled peacefully and international law is respected.
I completely agree. It's a reminder that even in a world where might often makes right, there's still a place for the rule of law and the pursuit of justice.
Well said. And for all of you listening, especially those aspiring diplomats, international law enthusiasts, or anyone with a passion for global affairs, I think the key takeaway here is that the ICJ is more than just a court. It reflects our collective aspiration for a world where disputes are settled peacefully and international law serves as a guiding principle for how nations interact.
It's a reminder that building a more just and peaceful world order requires institutions like the ICJ, even with their imperfections.
And on that note, it's time for us to surface from our deep dive into the International Court of Justice. We hope you found it as enlightening as we did. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on future explorations of the world's most fascinating topics. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the boundless ocean of knowledge.